Hello, and welcome to this edition of Geostrategy in Action, a new videocast series in which we explore how companies around the world are adapting their operations and strategies to key geopolitical developments. I'm Courtney Rickert McCaffrey. I'm the EY Global Geostrategy Insights Leader. And today we're going to dive into how geopolitics is affecting global supply chains. So we've obviously seen some pretty significant trade policy volatility in the past few months, with tariffs a big focus for many of our clients. We're also seeing some trade liberalization efforts by some markets around the world. So all of this really raises a lot of questions about how companies could and should adapt their supply chains to these new policies and geopolitical realities. Certainly every conversation I've had with executives in the past few months has revolved around tariffs and trade and supply chain. So I'm really pleased to introduce Brad Newman, the EY Global Consulting Supply Chain and Operations Leader, to join me for this conversation today. So
thanks for having me, Courtney.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you know, in our recent Geostrategy in Practice survey, executives told us that political risks have primarily impacted their company's operations and supply chains in the past couple of years. So as a result, we've seen a lot of companies make some pretty strategic changes in their supply chains in terms of reconfiguring them, relocating operational assets. So this is what they told us in the survey, but I just wanted to check with you. Does that align with what you've been seeing with clients in recent years and what you've been hearing from executives that you work with?
Absolutely. This shift is really, quite frankly, it's been underway for some time. But it's fair to say it's really, gaining momentum these days in light of all the policy changes. And so, if you really just kind of step back and kind of think about the world, there's a lot going on, right? And it comes in many, different flavors. And so we've had, huge advancements in computing power. We've got AI, we've got, evolving labor rates, new environmental legislation, increased use of automation, global tax policy continues to shift. We're seeing new incentives. And of course, we've got wars and conflicts, taking place in several, parts of the world. And so when you kind of just, add it all up, there's a lot going on, and we're really starting to kind of see what I'm calling the great supply chain reset. And if you kind of generalize a little bit, if you think of the traditional, kind of classical supply chain of the past, it was really all about economies of scale. And so these were large, linear, global supply chains that were really, kind of focused on kind of the lowest possible, unit of cost, minimizing inventory in the chain. And what we're really starting to see is a shift away from that model, whereby, supply chains are more segmented, more regionalized, and, maybe gone are the days of companies, committing to single source a lot of their supply. They're looking for flexibility in and across their networks.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I like how you highlighted that it's not just about geopolitics or some of these policy changes that we've been seeing, but there's actually much broader trends and more structural trends at play as well. So I wonder if you could kind of connect that to what we've been seeing more recently in terms of some of the journey that some of our clients have been on maybe these past few months. How have they sort of shifted their supply chain planning or strategy during this period of really heightened tariff volatility and uncertainty?
Well, as you said, it's not just about tariffs, but tariffs certainly has kind of poured a little bit of gasoline on the fire, if you will. And and this has impacted companies in a lot of different ways. And so, in kind of the early days, there was a real race, quite frankly, just to understand the impact. And we've really kind of seen that start to move. Companies do now understand the impact, and they're spending a lot of time doing. They're looking at different scenarios, right, and starting to model those scenarios, and in some cases, starting to kind of take action as things, become a little more clear, recognizing that the situation will continue to evolve. And it has been interesting, right? We've seen, companies that didn't have a trade function in some cases having to stand it up just to, comply with new regulations. We've seen companies that may have visibility into their suppliers, but they can't see into their suppliers to truly understand, country of origin. And everybody's really, trying to figure out, total landed cost. And so it's not just about the cost of product. It's kind of the all-in cost. And I want to also say that depending upon where you are in the world, sustainability in the environment is also, very important as well. And so companies are looking at their carbon footprint. They're looking at the impact of taxes, both direct and indirect, and then also, their production costs.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. What you mentioned scenarios, and that's certainly something we've seen be a really valuable tool in a lot of instances over the past several years. But I think particularly for supply chains, just because it's so unclear, maybe which direction trade policy and globalization is going to go. I'm wondering, with some of the clients you've been working with recently, what's the sort of time horizon that they're looking at in terms of those scenarios? Because obviously, if we're talking about operational location movements, that has a very long time period associated. Maybe switching suppliers is a little easier, but is there anything around time frame and how companies are assessing those scenarios?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're doing the best to honestly look at multiple, right? And so they're, under the pressure of dealing with the here and now. But quite frankly, they are trying to look out in the future. And this is where it really starts to kind of depend on, the nature of a company's supply chain, the capital intensiveness of, say, their manufacturing facilities. In some cases, companies, operations are fairly portable, right? I mean, if you had to, you could knock them down and stand them back up in another location and do that in, say, a period of a couple months in a real aggressive case. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you have, very large facilities in some cases that require, billions of dollars of capital and, it may take, 4 or 5 years to kind of qualify to produce, parts that can be sold to a trading partner.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, as you mentioned, all of the geopolitics is just one part of the picture. So I don't know if you could dig a little deeper and kind of share how companies maybe are combining sort of their assessment of tariffs and trade policy with, sustainability or maybe labor pressures. That's something I'm getting questions from some clients about in terms of where is the labor force of the future? How can they find the right skills for their operations and suppliers? So I don't know if you could share any examples of how companies are kind of weaving all that together to try to make a more holistic decision.
Well, you raise a great point. I mean, there are a lot of variables that go into the equation, and for as much as I think companies would like to be able to put it all into a formula that would spit out an answer, it's just simply not that easy. And so I think the big thing is they are taking a more comprehensive look, and so um, you mentioned, kind of the talent market. We have in recent years, kind of post COVID, been dealing with, labor shortages, right, and changing immigration policies. And we've also kind of seen, a fluctuation in wage rates. I think, as we know, we've had, many companies, kind of chasing, global, low cost sources of labor. And so, I think one of the things we really see, and this is where you kind of see the advancement in kind of technology coming into play. A lot of companies are really starting to kind of rethink automation and, maybe stop chasing, labor and look at, to what extent can they automate things. Um, and so, and the other thing that is a really big factor that has to be considered is sustainability, and I think this is probably most prevalent in Europe, and with some new regulations in the EU, in particular, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And so, companies are looking at sustainability not only from a product perspective in how they make things, but also are looking at their overall, kind of carbon footprint. And so as they look at, their footprint and their network, they're really, trying to kind of take all those factors into consideration and do the best they can to see in the future. But as better than most, it'd be really easy if all the new regulations and changes and cost of labor was kind of announced on the same day and would stay consistent for the next year, but it's just not the reality of the world we lived in. And so I think the key word going forward really is agility, and it's agility from an overall footprint perspective, but quite frankly, it's agility related to how companies operate as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great point. I mean, we are seeing certainly policy change and regulatory change and geopolitical tensions kind of move at different rates. And obviously there's some divergence between some key markets around the world. So I know some companies have also been trying to figure out how the challenge of sort of how to comply with different rules and regulations in multiple markets at once that may be, putting different pressures on companies. So I think that's a really good point to raise as well. Um, I guess, one last question maybe before we wrap it up is just around sort of any sector-based trends that you're seeing. I mean, do you see companies in certain sectors maybe moving faster than others or moving in different ways than others? I know this is something that often we do see differences by sector, but I wonder if this is a sort of across the board story, or if you're seeing any particular sectors that stand out.
Well, I think the answer is definitely that we are seeing differences by sector. There's no question about it. And quite frankly, there are some sectors in particular as it relates to the US and the current administration that are still under investigation. So things like, pharma and semiconductors. And so, we're still kind of, waiting to kind of see the impact in those particular sectors. But, I think the one that, and it's probably been in the news the most is really the automotive industry, right? And they're getting hit both as it relates to, tariffs related to steel and aluminum, but also just more broadly, in automobiles. And where I think it gets really interesting in the auto industry is just the complexity of a car, right? And you look at the number of components and the depth of materials and the bill of material. And when you start to kind of recognize that a lot of those components, are shipped from different points around the world, I think it's been an industry that has really had to scramble to understand the impact, and then quite frankly, there's a lot of work to kind of deal with the impact. And so, things like, price increases and things like that. And so, I'd have to go with auto sticking out as the one that's, probably under, the most pressure right now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think building on something you just said, that transparency of supply chains, so not only the automaker suppliers, but their suppliers and on down the line, because obviously a lot of those inputs are, metals and minerals and things like that are determined by geology in terms of where they come from originally. So a lot of sort of out of their control as well. So just reemphasizing that transparency across the entire supply chain is really critical. All right. Well, thank you, Brad. This was a fascinating conversation. And I think, from my end of the world, I guess, in the geopolitical realm, the key word this year seems to be uncertainty. It sounds like dealing with that uncertainty from your point of view is all about agility. So I guess those would be the two words I'll leave you with today. So thank you again, Brad, for joining us. And thank you all for watching.
Thanks, Courtney.